So atrial fibrillation, I think, is one of the important topic, because most of the patients in wards, ICU, and I will be knowing even in medical wards, they will be having some form of the narrow QRS tachycardia, which is irregular. And the most common narrow QRS tachycardia, which is irregular, is atrial fibrillation, apart from, as we discussed before, flutter with variable block and multifocal atrial tachycardias. But today we'll discuss upon the atrial fibrillation, why it is important, how to diagnose it, and how to manage it, and what are the various aspects of management. So it's a supraventricular tachyarrhythmia, as we know, with an uncoordinated atrial activation, and it is an ineffective contraction. So that is one important thing, because we know, as the name suggests, fibrillation, it's all the different part of the atria. It's divided into various circuits, and they are having an uncoordinated activation. And we know on the ECG we see irregular RR intervals, absence of distinct repeating P waves. Sometimes we can see P wave. Many people tell that there are P waves which are actually not a P waves, but they are F waves. F waves are fibrillatory waves. So we can have fine fibrillatory waves and we can have coarse fibrillatory wave. Fine fibrillatory, it is very less than 0.5 millivolts, whereas the coarse fibrillatory, there are more than 0.5 millivolts. So that is one important thing. We should not tell it as a P wave, but you should tell it as a F wave. And also we have a low amplitude fibrillatory wave. Now, one of the important clinical thing which you should know in exam, whenever you have such a case, you should always see the ECG. And on the ECG, if any irregular tachycardia is there, you know that the ECG, 12 lead ECG is around 10 seconds, and you calculate the number of RR intervals in that 10 second and multiply it by 6. So this is how we calculate in ECG ventricular rate in presence of atrial fibrillation. So that is one thing which you should all know. And some people do, there are various ways, that 300 and all, but this is the one of the easiest way which you can do. Now, as we know, the atrial rate is very high in atrial fibrillation. It's around 300, and it can sometimes rarely go up to 600 beats per minute. However, the ventricular rate is something which is important. We know the ventricular rate in AF is usually something between 100 to 160, and anything which is more than 100 is called atrial fibrillation with fast ventricular rate, and anything which is less than 100 usually is atrial fibrillation with slow ventricular rate. However, there is a variant of AF where it is a WPW with AF. We know that is the only broad QRS tachycardia which is irregular. That is AF with WPW, where the ventricular rate can go beyond 250, and that is one of the where the patient can present with palpitation and syncope. So that is one thing which is very important. Now, third important thing is, if you are having a patient with AF and now his RR interval has suddenly become regular, then few things you have to think of. So AF with regular RR, you have to think of first is complete heart block. If AF patient who developed complete heart block. Second, in a pacemaker, a patient with AF is having a pacemaker, then the rhythm will become regular. And third thing is digitalis toxicity. So these three things are very important in a patient who has AF and whose RR interval becomes regular. So pacemaker rhythm, complete heart block, and digitalis toxicity are something which you should know. Now, this is what I told you. So even in the presence of AF and a regular RR, you will be able to see the presence of fibrillatory fine or coarse P waves. So that is one thing which is important. Now, there are hemodynamic consequences in presence of AF. So it can be because of the suboptimal ventricular rate control. That is, it can be either too rapid or too slow. We know sometimes there is something known as a sick sinus syndrome, where the most common, where one of the variants is Tachy-Brady syndrome. So the tachycardia is the most commonly atrial fibrillation, and then the bradycardia aspect also. So that is one thing which is important. Then loss of coordinated atrial contraction, beat to beat vary. Because of the AF, there is a beat to beat variability in ventricular filling, and that is why we get the varying intensity of the first heart sound. Then we have sympathetic activation. So these are the various hemodynamic consequences. Now, second thing is loss of atrial contraction. Now, the atrial in a patient who's there is no structural heart disease, the loss of atrial contraction may not have much effect, because it decreases the cardiac output for sure. But in a patient whose left ventricle is not good, like a patient who has severe LV dysfunction, in a patient who has mitral stenosis, in a patient who is aortic stenosis or severe hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and restrictive cardiomyopathy. In this patient, as already the ventricular compliance is poor, so if the atrial contraction is also gone, the patient will have very low cardiac output and will go for pulmonary edema. So this is one important thing which is important there. Now, why is knowing about atrial fibrillation is important? Because the prevalence is very high. It's 3% adults over 20 years, 20 and above. So that is a big number. So out of 100, 3 may have about 20 years, whereas the incidence is 0.1% per year before 40 years. So before 40 years is 0.1% per year, which is again a big number. And it's more than 2% per year above 80 years. So the incidence increases as the age increases. That is something which we should know, that the AF increases as the age increases, and there are many factors, because LV hypertrophy, LV becomes a non-compliant, diastolic dysfunction. Because of that, LA size increases, which is one of the important factors for atrial fibrillation. Now, in terms of morbidity and mortality, AF causes twofold increase in the risk of all-cause mortality in women, whereas 1.5-fold in men. So it is definitely one of the important predictors of mortality in any disease. It causes 5 times increased risk of stroke, and that is why management of anticoagulation is very important. As heart failure and sudden deaths are very common. Morbidity is heart failure and stroke. 20 to 30% patients with ischemic stroke have AF. So suppose you are seeing a patient in a neurological ward and who has a ischemic stroke. We are not talking about the lacunar stroke. We are talking about the non-lacunar stroke. So in all those cases, if you have a baseline sinus rhythm, you should always do a Holter monitoring for at least 72 hours. So the guideline says it should be done for at least 72 hours a Holter. And if you do in 100 patients, 20 to 30%, you will definitely find a atrial fibrillation. And why that is important is again to anticoagulate them. So the average stroke rate is 1.5% and annual death rate is 3% in anticoagulated AF patients. So even on anticoagulation, the risk of stroke and the mortality is still there. And AF in asymptomatic patient can cause the white matter lesions, cognitive impairment, depressed mood, and decreased quality of life. So these are the other neurological manifestations of atrial fibrillation. Now, the incidence and prevalence of AF in women is low. However, the death is similar or higher as compared to the men. Though the incidence and prevalence is low, the mortality is almost same or more than the male population. And bleeding risk is similar both in the males and female population. Now, this is something which is important is, if we think that the AF is not AF itself has some genetic predisposition, because if you see AF in a young that we do not encounter more commonly, but suppose you see AF in a 14-year, 20-year patient, always consider that there is a heritable component and the genetic component. Now, there are many cardiomyopathies which have AF. Then many channelopathies like Brugada syndrome and all, they have associated atrial fibrillation. And the more common genes which are associated are PITX2 and abnormalities in the sodium and potassium channels. And that is why Brugada has commonly associated with AF because of the sodium channel involvement. So that is something which you should know is genetic predisposition to AF. Now we know there are structural abnormality, any disease, let it be ischemic heart disease, valvular heart disease, congenital heart disease, pericardial disease, or cardiomyopathy, they all produce a structural abnormality in the left atrium. And then we have functional abnormality. It's so both the anatomical and functional abnormality can be there, which lead to the AF. And as we discussed in the previous class, all the mechanism of AF is re-entry. So we have different heterogeneities in the refractory period in the LA of the various fibers which cause a re-entry, and that is what produces AF. So in a dilated LA, there is microfibrosis which causes the re-entry. Now, as I again told you, cardiac factors called the atrial structural abnormalities, and then there can be extra cardiac factors. All of them leads to atrial dilatation, increased stress, and increased LA pressure. So the important thing is microfibrosis and inflammation and the hypertrophy inside the atria, which causes a micro re-entry circuit. It's not a macro re-entry, but it's a micro re-entry circuit. Now let's discuss the etiology again. So the most common factor or a cardiac factor for AF is hypertension. We know it's not any ischemic heart disease or valvular. It's the hypertension which is the most common cause for atrial fibrillation. Then we have the coronary artery disease, valvular heart disease. Most common is the mitral stenosis, followed by we can have MR, AS, AR. All those can have in the later stages. Heart failure itself can cause atrial fibrillation. Any dilated cardiomyopathy because of atrial dilatation can cause AF. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, one of the important manifestation is AF because they present with palpitations. In pericardial disease like CCP, we can have AF. Apart from that, the infiltrative diseases like sarcoid and all amyloidosis can present with AF. But you should always know the extra cardiac factors, like you should ask the history of alcohol, which we know as the holiday heart syndrome, that usually presents with atrial fibrillation. Hypertension is one of the cause. Obesity is one of the important cause for atrial fibrillation. Obstructive sleep apnea. Then thyrotoxicosis. So in all the patients with AF, in a young or old, we should always rule out hyperthyroidism or thyrotoxicosis. Then there are various drugs like IF for cardiac drugs like ivabradine and all, which can cause atrial fibrillation. So a list of drugs is also important. As I already discussed, it ultimately leads to a myocardial fibrosis, atrial fibrosis. There is profibrotic signaling, and then there is all the activation of the RAS and transforming growth factor beta. So this is not much important, but it has role in catheter ablation. So I have already discussed the mechanism. Let's just any extra cardiac factors can lead to atrial fibrosis, dilatation, hypertrophy, inflammation, and then we can have increased heterogeneity of the fibers in the atria, which causes the micro re-entry circuit inside the atria. Now, there are always two things. There should be a trigger for initiation and there is a substrate for maintenance. These two things are important. So which are the various triggers which we should know are, one is ectopic atrial discharges, and then there are LA myocardial sleeves. Now let's see all the triggers from where the atrial fibrillation can start. We know LA, but there are various things around the LA which can be a source of atrial fibrillation, and the most common are the pulmonary vein. That is why pulmonary vein isolation is an important thing for the management of atrial fibrillation. Second important other are the posterior wall of left atrium, ligament of Marshall. In the coronary sinus also AF can originate. SVC, IVC junction in the vena cava. Then we can have in the septum, interatrial septum, and the appendages like the LA appendage or even the RA appendage. So these are the various triggers or the initiation of atrial fibrillation. As you can see in the figure, the sinus node, this is a coordinated atrial activity. Whereas in presence of atrial fibrillation, because of the different heterogeneity of the conduction velocities, conduction refractory periods are different, there is a re-entry circuit. So it is also known as the wavelet theory. There are different wavelets which are traveling. It's also known as the wavelet theory and or the rotors. I don't want to go too much into the details into the pathogenesis, but that is important thing is re-entry, micro re-entry. Now, many a times you will encounter this something known as the vagotonic AF. The patient may present to emergency department with AF, and you will ask there will be a history of vomiting. So sometimes vomiting and all can cause atrial fibrillation, and the important thing is it is due to a vagal mediated AF. Also sometimes because during sleep or following food they can have AF. One of the important thing is digitalis is cause vagotonia and can cause AF. One of the important treatments is disopyramide. So the disopyramide has a vagolytic action and it can be used for the treatment of vagotonic AF. Now, again, coming to the risk factor, there are some reversible factor like the alcohol or post-op patient undergoing cardiothoracic and non-cardiac surgery, post-MI, pericarditis itself can precipitate AF, myocarditis, hyperthyroidism, patient with sepsis, pneumonia, pulmonary embolism or pulmonary hypertension, and electrocution. So these are some of the reversible factors. Now, how do the patients with AF present? The most common, sometimes they will be asymptomatic. You just see a ECG and then you find a AF if their ventricular rate is low. However, because of the fast ventricular rate, because of the LV filling is not there, the patient will have low cardiac output and can present with fatigue. Then they can also present with palpitation, and most of the time they describe this as irregular palpitations. And because of in patients who have LV dysfunction, aortic stenosis, hypertension, HCM, if AF is there, so as I told you, they may have a higher tendency to go for pulmonary edema, and they may present with dyspnea because of the high ventricular rate, because of the low cardiac output. Patient may present with syncope and hypotension, and they can present with heart failure either because of pulmonary increased pulmonary wedge pressure increases, or because of tachycardia. A patient who is normally LV, because of if he is in long time in atrial fibrillation, it can cause something known as tachycardia cardiomyopathy, and that is one of the important cause of heart failure. And many patients present with just stroke. They present with stroke, you see ECG, they have AF. So these are how various the AF can present itself as. Now that is something which is important, is physical examination. So what are the things which you have to look in presence of AF is, when you do examination, pulse is most important, because irregular pulse goes in favor of AF. And then you should see the apex pulse deficit, because normally the apex pulse deficit is more than 10 in presence of AF. However, less than 10 doesn't exclude AF. We say the less than 10 pulse apex pulse deficit usually is ventricular ectopic. However, if the AF has slow rate, like in patient on calcium channel blocker, beta blocker, or if AF only has a low rate, then you may not get a apex pulse deficit. Because of the variable filling of the LV, we get a varying intensity of the first heart sound. And the most important thing is JVP, there is the absence of A wave and a blunted or absent X descent. So these are the things on physical examination which you should know, but you should also see all the peripheral pulses, because AF itself can lead to embolization. So all the peripheral pulses are there or not. Now, coming to the important clinical part of the AF, we have the AF classification. Now, this classification is something which is very overlapping and sometimes be confusing. But for a gross thing, the AF is classified as paroxysmal, is one which lasts less than 7 days. However, and the persistent is one which is more than 7 days. And it's not like that ki paroxysmal AF are the one which do not need treatment and can recover by themselves. Even if you give cardioversion, or even if you give drugs like amiodarone, and if the patient AF becomes sinus rhythm, then also it is a paroxysmal. It's not like if without treatment they should revert. However, if it persists more than 7 days, then it is known as a persistent AF. Long standing AF is the AF which is more than 1 year. And a permanent AF is AF which lasts more than 1 year, but even after you give all the anti-arrhythmic drug, anticoagulation, there is no reversion to sinus rhythm. So in a permanent AF, the difference is all the therapies like DC cardioversion or anti-arrhythmic therapy has failed to convert to the sinus rhythm. Now means now there is no point of achieving a rhythm control in such case. So that is something which is a permanent AF, whereas a persistent AF is something which is more than 1 year. And then we have another classification as a valvular and non-valvular AF. Valvular AF are all rheumatic heart diseases, rheumatic valvular heart diseases like moderate to severe MS, MR, AS, AR, and patient who have patient who are on mechanical valve. Sometimes in some classification, a mechanical valve is still considered as a valvular AF, but for all practical reasons, both the mechanical and bioprosthetic valves are considered as non-valvular AF. But still, we do not give anticoagulation for means we do not give novel oral anticoagulant for this because still in some classification it is still considered as a valvular AF. Now, again coming to that, the AF that terminates spontaneously or with intervention within 7 days of onset is called paroxysmal, and these episodes may recur with variable frequency. Persistent is something which is sustained beyond 7 days. A long-standing persistent is more than 12 months, more than 1 year in duration. And a permanent is acceptance of AF by, so you are the accepted that the AF is there and you do not no longer want to maintain the sinus rhythm because all the attempts have been failed. Now again, what is a non-valvular AF is AF in absence of a rheumatic mitral stenosis. So there were many controversies, but they told only moderate to severe mitral stenosis is considered as valvular. Any mild rheumatic mitral stenosis will still be considered as non-valvular. Even a mild MR, which is rheumatic, will be considered as non-valvular. Bioprosthetic is definitely a non-valvular AF, and after a patient undergoes mitral valve repair, not replacement, repair, it is considered as a non-valvular AF. So these are the various clinical types of AF as I discussed. It can be secondary to the structural heart disease like valvular, ischemic, coronary artery disease, cardiomyopathy, pericardial disease, congenital heart disease, or there can be a focal AF. Then we have polygenic AF, some of the genetic AFs. Post-operative AF is something which is important. Many a times you will get consultations like the patient has atrial fibrillation after surgery. And that is because some of them patient may have risk factors like diabetes, hypertension and all. And one of the important thing is if the patient has risk factors, one of the things which can prevent post-op AF is starting statins and beta blockers prior to the surgery. And because in post surgery there are various factors like the inflammation, high sympathetic tone, and dyselectrolytemia, volume overload, and all this may cause the AF. In a patient with mitral stenosis or heart valve, athletes can have AF and monogenic AF in various cardiomyopathies, channelopathies like the Brugada and all. So these are the various clinical subtypes. Like we have NYHA classification, Canadian Cardiovascular Society for dyspnea, angina, palpitation. AF also has a symptom scale which is known as the European Heart Rhythm Association scale. So class 1 is one where the AF does not cause any symptom. All the asymptomatic AFs will be class 1. 2A is normal daily activity not affected. 2B is normal daily activity is not affected, but patient troubled by other symptoms. So AF related symptoms are not there, but other symptoms are there. 3 is the symptoms related to AF are there, and 4 is normal daily activities discontinued, which we don't see most commonly because of the AF. Now let's coming to the screening. So when do we screen for AF? We know the class 1 recommendation now in the latest ESC guideline is all the patient above 65 years of age should undergo one ECG in their lifetime, because we know that more than 80 years of age, the risk of AF is 2% per year. So more than 65 years of age, everybody should have a ECG to look for AF. Now, as I already told you, if a patient who presents with transient ischemic attack or stroke, that is the non-lacunar ones, then you should do a web cardio or a Holter for 72 hours and look for AF. Because one important thing is, if somebody has AF, even 15 minutes of AF is more than enough to produce a thrombus. So 15 minutes of AF is more than enough to produce a thrombus. And when do we call a patient has AF on a web? Suppose a sinus ECG doesn't show AF and a Holter rhythm shows 30 seconds of AF. So if it is 30 seconds also, then you can call it a AF. But less than 30 seconds is usually clinically not much significant. So 30 seconds is something where you decided to call it a AF. And in many patients who have undergone ICD or pacemaker, you can see for high rate atrial events to see for AF. Now, patient without known AF and who present with high rate events on a ICD or a pacemaker, we should just see whether the AF is diagnosed or not. If the AF is diagnosed, then they definitely need anticoagulation. Whereas if there is no AF, if there should be no antithrombotic therapy. But everything is depending on the CHA2DS2-VASc score, which I'll come into. Yeah. So what all tests will you do in presence of a AF? First, 12 lead ECG. As I told you, the importance of 12 lead ECG. Apart from knowing the underlying disease, you should also know the atrial rate, ventricular rate, whether it's AF with fast rate, slow rate, whether you have to go for rate control, you have to go for rhythm control, you have to go for anticoagulation. Renal function tests are important because CKD is an important predisposing factor for AF. Even dyselectrolytemia like hypokalemia can cause AF. TFT is very important as hyperthyroidism or thyrotoxicosis is an important cause of AF. Echo, you have to see why echo is important, not only to see the structural heart disease, but LA size. Because if the left atrial size is more than 55 millimeter, there is very less chances that the patient may respond to cardioversion. Like even if you give cardioversion, which is either can be electrical or pharmacological, the chances of having a sinus rhythm is very low if LA is dilated more than 55 millimeter. And ambulatory ECG Holter in a group of patients like stroke, and TEE. So we know that there is the importance of TEE, that in a patient who has a new onset AF and you want to cardiovert him without giving anticoagulation for at least 3 to 4 weeks, or minimum at least 1 to 2 weeks, you should not do a cardioversion. So that is the importance of TE. You do a TE, you see there is no left atrial appendage clot or LA clot, you can directly go ahead with cardioversion. So next, coming to the stroke prevention. Anybody has any doubt can just ask or unmute and ask. Otherwise, I'll proceed. Right. So the management of AF is always divided into rate control, rhythm control, and stroke prevention. I'll start from the opposite way because the stroke prevention is very important. Now that we know that there are various groups of drugs like the conventional oral anticoagulation, which is the warfarin or the acetylene, and then we have the novel oral anticoagulants like the dabigatran or apixaban or rivaroxaban or edoxaban. Many are there in the market now, but the three are important. Now, the current thing is that in the guidelines, all the conventional anticoagulations are changed by a NOACs. So at present, in all the non-valvular, not the valvular, all the non-valvular AF, if the CHADVAS score, depending on the CHADVAS score, novel oral anticoagulation are the treatment of choice. Now the thing is they are become very cheaper in the, so as compared to before where we were not able to prescribe it, it is we can now definitely prescribe them. And stroke risk without oral anticoagulation often exceeds the bleeding risk. Now why this it came that if you are have a patient with AF and your CHADVAS score is 2 or more and you don't give anticoagulation, the chance of having a stroke is more than the chance of having a bleeding if you start. So stroke risk exceeds the bleeding risk. And that is why even in the elderly patient who have a frailty, cognitive dysfunction, you should not stop yourself from giving a anticoagulation if AF is there, because they are at very high risk. Now, when do you give is how do you predict this? You have to do a CHADVAS score, and the class 1 indication of giving a anticoagulation is if a male has a CHADVAS score of more than 2 and a female has a CHADVAS score of more than 3. That is class 1. But many a times in male population, even if CHADVAS score is 1 and female has CHADVAS score of 2 because in CHADVAS score female gender is calculated as 1 point. That is why the cutoff point for female is more. So if a score in male is more than 1 and female is 2, you can still give anticoagulation. But in that case, they told that the oral anticoagulant, conventional, are the better than the novel oral anticoagulations. So this is the CHADVAS score. I think all of you will be using in your day-to-day life the CHADVAS score because many AFs will be there. And this CHADVAS is only for non-valvular AF. Never use a CHADVAS for a valvular AF because a valvular AF always need anticoagulation irrespective of the CHADVAS score. So you should see if there is a congestive heart failure signs or symptoms are there or not. Second, hypertension has 1 point. Age 75 or more is 2 points, whereas the age 65 to 74 is 1 point. History of stroke is very great. It has 2 points. Presence of diabetes has 1 point. Vascular disease anywhere in the body, carotid, coronary, abdominal aorta, peripheral, anywhere is 1 point, whereas the female sex is counted as 1 point. So that has a CHADVAS. And why this CHADVAS is important is as the CHADVAS score increases, the annual risk of stroke, that is the percentage per year, increases. So we have a total of CHADVAS which can go up to 9, and so you can see the stroke risk is almost 20% per year if you have a CHADVAS score of 9, whereas a CHADVAS score of 1 to 2, or you can see the CHADVAS score of up to 4%, up to 2 has 4% per year risk. So that is important, that as the CHADVAS score increases, the stroke risk per year increases. So this is something which I was telling you. If you have a mechanical heart valve or a moderate to severe mitral stenosis, if that is there and AF is there, then you do not have any other option. You have to give conventional oral anticoagulation. However, if the AF is because of some other thing, then you have to calculate the CHADVAS score. If the CHADVAS score is 0, don't give anything. Before, what we used to do is we used to give aspirin. Aspirin is no longer indicated for a patient for stroke prevention. Let it be 0 or 1 CHADVAS. It has no role. A CHADVAS score of 1, oral anticoagulation should be considered, whereas at more than 2, if it is more than 2, then it is a class 1 indication. You have to give oral anticoagulation with either dabigatran or a ideal is your Novax, like the dabigatran, apixaban, rivaroxaban. Otherwise, if the financial or other any issue is there, like a CKD, many a times in patient with CKD who are on hemodialysis where creat clearance is less than 15, we cannot give any of this. So we have to give the conventional oral anticoagulation like warfarin. So both Novax and conventional heparins are class 1. However, the Novax have a better role compared to the conventional anticoagulation. And in patients who have contraindication to anticoagulation or who have already bled on anticoagulation, another treatment is the left atrial appendage occlusion, which we'll discuss sometime later. So this is what I told you. The CHADVAS score should be done in all the patients with AF. And then if we have a CHADVAS score, we should always have a bleeding score, because if your bleeding score is very high, then the anticoagulation it's little bit prohibited. And what is the most common score which we use is Has-Bled score. So H stands for hypertension, A stands for abnormal RFT and LFT, S stands for history of stroke, B stands for bleeding history or predisposition, L for labile INR, E for elderly, more than 65, and D for drugs or alcohol. So why is this important is, as you can see, the total score is 9, has bled, and a 0 to 2 score means the bleeding score is low. Whereas more than 2 means there is a high bleeding risk. And whenever the CHADVAS has bled goes beyond 5, it is better to avoid usually the anticoagulation and consider other modalities of AF treatment like the left atrial appendage occlusion and other things, because the chance of bleeding is very high if the has bled is more than 5. So the conventional ones were the warfarin or the acetylrome, and it reduces the stroke by 2/3 and mortality by 1/4 compared with aspirin and no therapy. So at present, the this slide one take home message is aspirin has no role in the stroke prevention in patient with atrial fibrillation. So either you do not have to give anything, or you have to give either a conventional oral anticoagulation or novel oral anticoagulation. And there is something known as a time in therapeutic range. So suppose if you do, so what is the time in therapeutic range for warfarin is, now suppose if the patient comes every once in 2 months for PT-INR monitoring. So in the last 3 times, if the patient is 2 times in therapeutic range, so INR we should maintain at 2 to 3. So in a warfarin, it usually never happens that all the 3 times you'll get the proper 2 to 3 values. So only 2 out of 3 chances it is possible that the patient will be in therapeutic range. So time for therapeutic range is around 66 to 70% in warfarin or acetylrome. But the newer oral anticoagulation, we did not monitor anything like PT, APTT. Though it very slightly raises the PT and APTT, there is no role for monitoring PT, APTT, and any other bleeding or profiles for novel oral anticoagulations. Now coming to the Novax, so we know that we have 3 varieties of, or many are there, but the most commonly which we use are dabigatran and apixaban and rivaroxaban. If you see, there are no trials which are done head to head between these two. All the studies are done comparing with warfarin. So the one out of the 3, the one which has superiority over the warfarin is apixaban. Apixaban is the only one which has superiority over warfarin, and the normal dose which we give is 5 milligram twice a day. In renal failure, like 15 to 30 creat clearance, we usually decrease the dose to 2.5 milligram twice a day, and less than 15 creat clearance, it is not advocated to give apixaban. So it reduced the stroke and systemic embolism by 21% compared to warfarin alone, and 31% reduction in major bleeding and 11% reduction in all-cause mortality. So that is the only drug which was proven superior and even had a mortality benefit in the studies. and rate of hemorrhagic stroke and intracranial hemorrhage were lower compared to warfarin. Even if one thing which you should know is if some patient has GI problem or bleeding, the only anticoagulation which is beneficial is rivaroxaban and apixaban, and always apixaban is preferred over rivaroxaban. So any GI bleed history, it is better to give apixaban or rivaroxaban compared to the warfarin or dabigatran. Now, next is the dabigatran, which all of us use right and left nowadays. And the trial which had used was the RELY trial. And the RELY trial had compared two doses of dabigatran, 110 and 150 compared to the warfarin. So the 150, the dose 150, both was non-inferior to warfarin, whereas the 110 was also non-inferior to warfarin. Now, what the difference was, if you give 150, even though there is non-inferiority to warfarin, but the bleeding risk was significantly reduced. So why we are giving dabigatran over warfarin is the bleeding risk is significantly reduced with 150 milligram BD. Now 110 milligram, though it is non-inferior to warfarin, the bleeding risk is almost similar. If you see the statistical wise, though the number wise they have fewer, 20% less, but statistically it was not significant. And that is why if you are giving some patient dabigatran, it is ideal to give 150 milligram unless the patient is more than 75 years or there is little creatinine clearance issues, where you can use 110 milligram. And GI bleeding is significantly increased by 50% in dabigatran group, and that is why with that history it is always apixaban or rivaroxaban which are advised. So again, as I told you, rivaroxaban is non-inferior to warfarin, and there is 21% reduction in stroke or embolism, though there is no reduction in the mortality or stroke or major events. So only drug which had proven mortality benefit was apixaban. It again can increase the GI bleeding events, but a significant reduction in hemorrhagic stroke and intracranial hemorrhage. Now this is a comparison. As we can see, the dabigatran has a significant renal excretion, whereas the rivaroxaban and apixaban has more of the hepatic excretion. Half-life is almost, the dabigatran is 12 to 7, whereas the others have little lower. And the important thing is the dose. Dabigatran is given at 150 twice a day or 110 twice a day. Rivaroxaban is given 20 milligram once a day. Apixaban is given 5 milligram twice a day. But important thing is, once your creatinine clearance is less, you should avoid all this drug except the apixaban, which is the only drug which is little bit safer with even a lower creat clearance. Some people use it even in patients who are on dialysis, as it is excreted by somewhat by kidneys. Edoxaban we don't use much. That is why I am not going to discuss about the edoxaban. Now, is there a role of antiplatelets? As I already discussed, though warfarin prevents stroke, embolism, myocardial infarction, and mortality better than single and dual antiplatelet therapy, and the bleeding risk is same with even the oral anticoagulation and the antiplatelet therapy. And it is no longer recommended for any patient with AF, even if the CHA2DS score is 0 to 1, where you don't have to give a anticoagulation. Now, this I already told you. The class 1 is indication is in a male patient whose CHA2DS score is 2 or more, and in a female patient whose CHA2DS score is 3 or more. You should all anticoagulate them. However, we usually follow a less threshold. In a male with CHA2DS score of 1 or more and a female with CHA2DS score of 2 or more, we usually give anticoagulation, which is class 2A, and there is nothing wrong. Whereas a warfarin or a acetrom is usually given in patients with valvular AF, like a moderate to severe mitral stenosis and mechanical heart valves. Then again, when the oral anticoagulation is initiated in AF, who is eligible for NOAC, a NOAC is recommended in preference to vitamin K antagonist. Then other important things are antiplatelet monotherapy is not recommended, as I already told you. Now, as I told you, if a patient, suppose a patient is taking warfarin or and has bled on warfarin, then usually the next recommendation is a NOAC, novel oral anticoagulation. However, if a patient still bleeds on NOAC also, then the one of the option is the left atrial appendage closure, because in most of the patient with non-valvular, we usually do it in a non-valvular AF, because the 80% of the thrombus forms in the left atrial appendage and only 20% of the thrombus forms in the atrium. That is why if you device close the left atrium, it may helpful for the prevention of stroke, but there is no mortality benefit, that we should know. And even the use of anticoagulation you can stop. And then there is another important thing is the surgical. So many patients who have mitral stenosis, mitral regurgitation and all, who are undergoing surgery like MVR, if they have a atrial fibrillation, what surgeons do is surgeons excise them, they exclude the atrial appendage, they remove the atrial appendage. So that is one thing which can be useful during the open heart surgeries. So after surgical occlusion or occlusion of exclusion of LA, it is recommended to continue the oral anticoagulation in at-risk patient. Now, how do you manage the bleeding patient? So suppose a patient is on either a warfarin azithromycin or on a NOAC, and patient is bleeding. So we have to see how minor is the bleeding or how major is the bleeding. Minor bleeding, we do not have to worry much. We should just stop the azithromycin for a day or two, and then till the INR is less than 2, we should not restart it. If the bleeding is moderate to severe, we know that usually if the INR is more than 4, and the bleed and any bleeding is there, we should ideally replace it with a FFP, that is a fresh frozen plasma. But we should try to delay adding vitamin K, because once you give vitamin K, the patients there will be a suppression in the formation of the clotting factors, and then again it becomes very difficult to again increase the INR. So as much as possible, delay by giving it FFP, which has very short duration of action. So vitamin K should be given only in intractable cases of bleeding. And a fresh frozen plasma or a single donor plasma or a platelet precipitate can be given. In NOACs, we do not have much option. Once the patient bleeds, though the antidotes are there, they are very costly and it is very difficult to get them also. So if your patient bleeds on NOAC, you have no other option. You just have to stop the NOACs, and then you manage symptomatically, like manage the blood by giving either the fluid or a dextran, those type of thing, or a blood transfusion, or a, and then platelet and all. FFP doesn't help much in those cases. Now we have some antidotes, like for the dabigatran, idarizumab is the antidote, whereas a rivaroxaban and apixaban, it is the adnexanet alpha. It's just for MCQ. You may not I don't know if any of you have used, but it's very useful if it is given early. You cannot use it beyond 24 hours and all, where there is no point of giving it. Now, suppose if the patient with acute coronary syndrome has atrial fibrillation, how do you manage? Now, this is very important, because many patients who have MIBC, they have atrial fibrillation. What we have to do is we have to give the dual anticoagulant triple therapy, like dual antiplatelet therapy with a third thing like anticoagulation. And then after 1 month, one of the antiplatelet we have to stop, and then continue the single antiplatelet and anticoagulation. However, if the AF is short lasting, less than 1 month, then you can stop the anticoagulation and just convert only the dual antiplatelet therapy. Now, next important thing is the rate control or the rhythm control. This is, I'll just wait for a minute. If any doubts are there, you can. Anybody has any doubts till now, they can just unmute and ask. Fine. Now, rate and rhythm control is a very controversial topic. Many studies had come, even if they are coming now also, and there was no study which has proven that the rate control or rhythm control is superior over rate control, or rate control is superior over the rhythm control. It all depends on the individual patient. When is rate control important? When is rhythm control important? Like rhythm control has its own benefit. Like if the patient is too much symptomatic, then you have to ideally have rhythm control. If the patient has a stroke, then you should do a rhythm control. Whereas if the patient has AF for longer than 1 year and all, if LA size is very big, more than 55 millimeters, then there is no benefit of rhythm control. So rate control at present is as good as rhythm control, and there is no survival advantage of rhythm control over rate control. Now, which group of patient, what is better? If a asymptomatic patient or a minimal symptomatic patient, more than 65 year, rate control is always better. In young patient, always remember rhythm control is most important. People 40, 50s, it's the rhythm control which is very important. If you have a persistent AF, it is reasonable to attempt to restore sinus rhythm with either antiarrhythmic drug or cardioversion at least once if it is less than 65 year. So if you are less than 65 year and you have a persistent AF more than 7 days, if the pharmacological therapy is not working, try at least once with a cardioversion. Give 2 or 3 weeks of oral anticoagulation, call him for a cardioversion, and do a cardioversion. You should at least attempt once a cardioversion to bring it to the sinus rhythm. And also in patients more than 65 years, if the AF is symptomatic, despite rate control, you should do a rhythm control. You have a good rate control, but the patient is symptomatic, you should always do a rhythm control. So each has its own benefit, and rhythm control should be used in young patient, people who are symptomatic despite the rate control, and in a patient who have a stroke. However, in the cases like dilated LA or a permanent AF, there is no benefit of rhythm control. Now, how do you control rate? That is the moment. All of you will be knowing we use beta blocker, calcium channel blocker, digitalis, all the drugs which we use for rate control. So in acute rate control, most commonly drugs are beta blockers and calcium channel blockers like diltiazem and verapamil. People even use IV beta blockers like metoprolol and esmolol for the acute rate control. However, in a critically ill patient with a severe impaired LV function, we know that it is very difficult because the BP is just 90 and 100, and you cannot use beta blocker or calcium channel blocker. That time it is the digitalis or digoxin which is helpful, and amiodarone. We always say that amiodarone has a rhythm control, but amiodarone also has a rate control properties. So IV amiodarone will be useful for rate control in a patient where we cannot use beta blocker or calcium channel blocker. And then it is the DC cardioversion. Now, DC cardioversion, I'll come to this after a few slides. So long-term rate control is first by beta blocker. It is always the first line, though it doesn't reduce all-cause mortality. And calcium channel blocker. We know that in patient with LV dysfunction less than 40% EF, we should not use calcium channel blocker. Where we can use digitalis. See, the digitalis is a drug which has no effect on mortality, and many trials have even showed that it is worse. It can cause mortality in a subgroup of patients. However, still is a good drug when if you have atrial fibrillation with LV dysfunction. And amiodarone is the fast or the last resort for a rate control. So as I already told you, if you need a rate control, you see a echo where the EF is less than 40%, then you have only two options, beta blockers or digoxin. So you can add either of this. And if it is more than 40%, you have beta blocker, calcium channel blocker, and or digoxin. Any of this you can use. When do you call a heart rate as control? So we know for clinical purpose, when you're performing in your exam, heart rate more than 100 is control ventricular fast ventricular rate, and less than 100 is control ventricular rate. However, according to the guideline, AF with control ventricular rate is at rest it should be less than 80, and with exercise it should be less than 110. So if it is less than 80 at rest and less than 110 with exercise, it is known as controlled ventricular rate. Now let's go to the rhythm control. So rhythm control can either be by pharmacological or it can be electrical. Because important issue is all the drugs, whatever the drugs are there, have their side effects. Class 1A, 1C, class 3, all have their side effects like QT prolongation, QRS duration increase, and other side effects. So side effect is something which is very problematic, and that is why many a times it's the DC cardioversion, like the electrical cardioversion, which is better. And you should always remember that DC cardioversion is always better than the pharmacological cardioversion. However, the pharmacological usually doesn't work or effective if the duration is more than 7 days, and it restores the sinus rhythm in 50% of the recent onset of AF. Whereas the electrical cardio version, the efficacy is very high, 90 to 95%. Now, what all drugs which we use? Now, before going to the further, I'll just remember one thing. If you have a patient with structural heart disease, means any patient who has a structural heart disease like mitral stenosis, AS, AR, pericardial disease, congenital heart disease, cardiomyopathy, LV dysfunction, in that cases, it's usually only the amiodarone group which is beneficial. You cannot give any other drug. Whereas all other drugs like the flecainide, propafenone, ibutalide, these drugs can be given even in only in patients with who do not have structural heart disease. So we tell that even left ventricular hypertrophy more than 15 millimeter is a structural heart disease, and in that group you should give amiodarone only. So this one thing you should remember before we go to the further slides. Now, suppose a patient who is admitted to you has AF. You see a patient who is having the a 40-year male who has atrial fibrillation. So what is for your first thing is you should always try to give rate control. So what you'll do is you start a beta blocker, most preferably a beta blocker. And if the rate is not controlled on beta blocker, what you try to do is then you try to maintain the sinus rhythm if the patient is symptomatic. And in all those cases, if there is no structural heart disease, you can try to give pill in the pocket. So what is a pill in the pocket is we can use either flecainide or propafenone. Propafenone is one thing which we do not use more commonly. The dose is 450 to 600 milligram. We more commonly use flecainide. You should always remember that the patient should know his symptom, that he has palpitation and he can see the pulse, that AF is there. In that case, if he takes the 200 milligram of flecainide, the reversion to sinus rhythm is very high. So that is one thing which is always important. And you should first dose should always be given in hospital and not out of hospital. Flecainide has some other issues like it has uh, anti-vagal activity, and it can suddenly increase the heart rate. That is why whenever you are giving flecainide to a patient, you should always try to give some AV nodal blocking drugs, because flecainide can increase the rate of AV node. So if you start a beta blocker before 12 hours before giving flecainide, the chances of AF getting converted to VT and VF will be less. So AF can suddenly precipitate to VF if you do not start beta blockers before starting flecainide. That is one thing which is very important. Now, amiodarone. Many a times we use amiodarone. I think all of you will be knowing the dose of amiodarone. The dose is 1 milligram per kg per minute for 6 hours and 0.5 milligram per kg per minute for 18 hours. The dilution and all of you will be knowing. But one important thing which you should know is uh, before starting the maintenance dose, the patient should receive full loading dose, and the loading dose of amiodarone is almost 10 gram. So you should make sure that the patient receive 10 gram of loading dose, because IV bolus followed by infusion itself is very long dose, and then we have to give 400 milligram twice a day for very long. 400 milligram, not twice a day, 400 milligram 3 times a day. So if you give loading dose infusion followed by 1 week of 400 milligram 3 times a day, you will reach the 10 to 15 milligram of loading dose, and then only you can start the maintenance dose, which is 200 mg BD followed by 200 mg once a day. And that is how amiodarone should be given. Amiodarone has a lot of side effects. If you know the acute side effect, it can cause QT prolongation. So that is one thing. And second is it can cause bradycardia. These two are the very important side effects, is QT prolongation and bradycardia. Then we know there are other side effects, like it can cause pulmonary fibrosis, it can cause hepatotoxicity, it can cause hyperpigmentation, it can cause corneal deposits. So these are the other side effects of amiodarone which we should know, apart from the common ones like the bradycardia and AV blocks, as well as the yeah. And when you give amiodarone, always make sure that you give in 5% dextrose and not the normal saline, because the amiodarone salt, it can cause thrombophlebitis. So you should always give in 5% dextrose. The reason being 5% dextrose doesn't cause much hypotension unlike normal saline, and it doesn't cause phlebitis. Propafenone is not much commonly available and we do not use it much commonly. So we have flecainide, which is better than propafenone. Ibutylide is a drug which is a IV parental form of, you can say, flecainide. So ibutylide is one drug which, where if you admit a young patient and you want to change it to sinus rhythm, so what you have to do is you have to admit the patient, do a transesophageal echo. If you do a transesophageal echo, you should rule out a LA clot, and after that you can give ibutylide, and the dose is 1 milligram over 10 minutes. And you can sometimes repeat a dose of 1 milligram. You should make sure patient doesn't have hypokalemia, hypomagnesemia, because it has a high tendency to cause QT prolongation and torsades G points. And that is why you should avoid in patients with baseline QT prolongation, hypokalemia, and hypomagnesemia. Pill in the pocket, I have already told you, you should do first dose should always be given in the hospital. You should tell about the should always the patient should be on a beta blocker before you give flecainide. The dose is 200 milligram OD followed by 100 milligram BD. So you can give 100 milligram twice a day for the maintenance of sinus rhythm, and it has to be continued lifelong for the maintenance of sinus rhythm. Now coming to the electrical cardioversion, this is very effective as compared to the pharmacological cardioversion. And you have to give a synchronized DC shock. We know that there are various energies like 25, 50, 100 and 200 joule. So at once you try to give a biphasic shock with 200 joule. Now few practical point I should always tell you, a cardioversion usually only helps if the mechanism of arrhythmia is re-entry or triggered activity. It doesn't helpful for automaticity, and that is why sinus tachycardia and all those arrhythmia do not revert with a cardioversion. What a cardioversion does is, if the fibers have a different refractory period, it causes the homogeneity of the refractory period and it stops the arrhythmia. That is second thing. When you are giving for AF, there are two ways. One, you can put anterior paddles, one in the sternum, second in the apex. But the best way is, if the patient is stable and you have to give, try to do an anteroposterior, one over the sternum and second over behind on the lateral border of the scapula. Between the two scapula you can give, because the energy which it delivers is more in the anteroposterior as compared to the anterior ones. You have to give at once 200 joules. Sometimes what they say is, if you give a amiodarone before cardioversion or ibutylide, so any drug if you give before cardioversion, the chances of cardioversion, means the conversion of AF to sinus, is very good. So these are few important points which I wanted to know about, tell you about the cardioversion. And efficacy is very high, 90 to 95% compared to the pharmacological cardioversion. Now this will, many of you will be asking, see, if I have not, I have a patient with the AF, can I cardio? What if the patient is having rate 200 and all? Any sick patient in ICU, AFS 200 rate on NORA DOPA, that is the one point where you do not have to see for like you have to you have anticoagulated or not. Those are not the group where you should think. You should just cardio what, because the benefit is more than the risk. Other group is, if the patient is stable and you want to electively anticoagulate cardio what, like you have given the patient pharmacological cardioversion, but you think that it's not working. Now you want to try one of the electrical cardioversion. You give the patient 3 weeks of anticoagulation. Give the patient 3 weeks of anticoagulation. Call him for an cardioversion, and then cardio what. So, but for if the AF is more than 48 hours, in AF which is less than 48 hours, you need not worry about the rhythm control and cardioversion. It's only for AF which is more than 48 hours. And in that case, if you have uh, planning to cardiovert, you should always do a transesophageal echo. Give oral anticoagulation, do a transesophageal echo, and then cardiovert the patient. So that is something which is very important. So this is again something I told you. If the patient is hemodynamically unstable, do not think of anything. Just cardiovert the patient. If it is hemodynamically stable and you want to do a pharmacological cardioversion, if there is no structural heart disease, you have many choices. Oral are the pill in pocket like propafenone and flecainide. IV are the ibutylide ones. If the patient has LVH more than 15 mm, coronary artery disease, mitral valve disease, LV dysfunction less than 50%, heart failure, In that group, you cannot give other drugs. You have to use only amiodarone, IV amiodarone or oral amiodarone. So that is something you should know. That is why amiodarone is very popular, because most of the patient with AF will have some structural heart disease, and we invariably end up giving amiodarone. Whereas a patient who does not have structural heart disease do not use amiodarone, because amiodarone is a drug which has so many side effects. If you give amiodarone for long, it can cause bradycardia, sinus node dysfunction, and many other side effects. And shorter duration of and one more thing which I forgot to tell you, if you're anticoagulating a patient, electrical cardioverting a patient, and so you have to see that after that you have to give anticoagulation. So you should give at least for 4 weeks of anticoagulation after electrical cardioversion. If the patient CHA2DS score is not less than more than 2, if it is more than 2, for then even if you do a chemical electrical cardioversion, you have to give lifelong anticoagulation, even if the patient attains the sinus rhythm. But you did not give the antiarrhythmic drug in that case. And short-term treatment, this is one thing I told you, that ideally antiarrhythmic drugs after electrical cardioversion are not needed, but sometimes a short-term treatment with flecainide for 4 weeks can prevent most of the recurrence. So some people even give 4 weeks of flecainide after a cardioversion to prevent the recurrence of AF. Now, I have already told this about the amiodarone, dose of the amiodarone, side effects of the amiodarone, how it should be given. Common side effects is QT prolongation. Similarly, dronidarone is a congener of amiodarone. It doesn't have iodine, and that is why all the side effects like hypothyroidism, that I forgot. One of the important side effect of amiodarone is hypothyroidism and hyperthyroidism. Hypothyroidism is more common than the hyperthyroidism. Dronidarone doesn't have iodine, so it doesn't cause hypo or hyperthyroidism, both of them. So that is one thing which you have to know. Flecainide, propafenone, and sotalol. Sotalol is another drug which people commonly give for AF, never give in patient with LV dysfunction, and because it causes very significant QT prolongation. Very significant QT prolongation, the sotalol. There are few other antiarrhythmic drugs which are not commonly used, but in some smaller studies they have used. Ranolazine, which is commonly used as an anti-anginal drug, it is used sometimes for the preventing the recurrence of AF. People do use ranolazine. Ivabradine, if a patient has AF, never use ivabradine because it increases the risk of atrial fibrillator. Apart from this, ACE inhibitors in previous studies or ARBs, it prevents the new onset AF mainly in patients with diabetic and hypertension and LV dysfunction. It doesn't have any other antiarrhythmic properties. Statins in very smaller trials have been used for as an antiarrhythmic effect, and even the beta blockers. Now, after all this drugs, there are some other things like, as I already told you, AF ablation, like a catheter ablation. So which group of patients should receive catheter ablation? Because that is one area where the side effect is more than the benefit. So if you do a procedure, a catheter ablation, let it be pulmonary vein isolation or any other thing, the side effect of the procedure is always more than the benefit. And so you should always do in a patient who is more likely to benefit from a catheter ablation. And who are this group of patients are symptomatic paroxysmal persistent AF patients who continues to have symptom on all the drugs. Second is if the drugs have failed, as I already told you. Third is young AF, people who are 30, 40 years, young AF who do not respond to drugs for them. And if the AF is associated with tachycardia, cardiomyopathy, if there is a persistent AF which is causing cardiomyopathy, then you have to ablate the AF. So these are the group of patient who are benefits more than more to catheter ablation. So as I told you, first patient less than 35 years with symptomatic AF, if a patient with sinus node dysfunction in whom antiarrhythmic drug may lead to permanent pacemaker implantation. So in that group of patient you can do. And if patient is refractory to drug therapy, you should do catheter ablation. However, if there is a thrombus in the appendage or in the left atrium, you should never do a catheter ablation. And why do we do is, one is to prevent decrease the recurrent AF, it improves the symptoms and it improves the LV ejection fraction. The next is the surgical approach. In surgical approach, what we do is after opening the heart, you make incisions around the atria. 12 atrial incisions are made to isolate the pulmonary vein, because pulmonary vein is the one of the most common site for atrial fibrillation. And then you can excise the left atrial appendage, as I already told you. In most of the time, in patient who are undergoing surgeries with AF, left atrial appendage is excised. Yeah, so these were the various management of AF. I think I have made it simpler and I did not complicate it too much. So if any doubts, can ask.